He walked into the bank with nothing but quiet, confidence, and a folded check in his pocket. The lobby was buzzing with the hum of customers, the mechanical click of pens at counters, and the low murmur of conversations. To anyone watching, he was just another man, moving with purpose, waiting for his turn. But the moment he slid that check across the counter, $10,000, legally earned, carefully saved, something in the air shifted. The teller's smile faltered. Her eyes darted from the number on the paper to the color of his skin, and suddenly, silence weighed heavier than the polished marble floor beneath his shoes. Within minutes, whispers turned to calls, and the calls summoned uniforms. The cuffs clicked around his wrists before he could even catch his breath. Strangers watched with wide eyes, some with pity, some with judgment, but none with understanding. To them, he wasn't a father, a son, a professional, or a man who had worked every long night to earn that money. To them, in that moment, he was reduced to a single narrative written, centuries before he was born: black man, money crime. The script was so familiar to the officers that they didn't pause to question it. He was walked out of the bank as though he had committed the worst of sins, though his only act was daring to deposit what he rightfully earned. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that this wasn't just another arrest. This wasn't another name buried in statistics, another quiet humiliation brushed under the rug of procedure. They had picked the wrong man, at the wrong time, with the wrong assumptions. Because this man was not only innocent, he was connected, educated, and determined. They had underestimated him, and in doing so, they had underestimated the quiet storm that had been building for generations. As the car door slammed and the officers exchanged confident glances, believing they had executed another day's work, he sat in the back seat, staring out the window, not with fear, but with resolve. He knew exactly what they had done, and more importantly, he knew exactly what he was about to do. The story wasn't ending in handcuffs. It was only beginning. The station smelled of stale coffee and cold steel, the kind of place where humanity was stripped down to paperwork and fingerprints. They processed him with the same robotic efficiency they used on everyone, except this time, their routine arrogance carried a different edge. They thought they had cornered a man who fit the story they'd written in their minds. A black man with too much money in his account, suspicious by default, guilty until proven otherwise. The officer at the desk barely looked him in the eye as he rattled off questions, typing answers without care, as if the details didn't matter. "Where did you get the check?" he asked. "What's your employer's name?" His tone was laced with accusation, not inquiry. The man answered calmly, his voice steady. His gaze locked on the officers, making sure every word carried weight. He could have raised his voice, demanded respect, or cursed the injustice pressing against his skin, but he knew the system thrived on black anger. It fed on it, twisted it, and used it as proof of guilt, so he gave them nothing but poise. But beneath that calm exterior, fire burned. Every click of the handcuffs, every dismissive glance, every assumption clawed at old wounds. His grandfather had told him stories of men dragged from their homes for less, men who never came back from the cells they were thrown into. He wasn't just living his own story, he was carrying theirs too, and in that weight he found strength. He would not let this moment destroy him. He would use it. As hours stretched on, he watched the officers exchange smug grins, confident they'd uncovered another fraud, another criminal to pad their statistics. They didn't bother to dig deeper. If they had, they would have discovered that the man they had chained and mocked was no ordinary target. He was a graduate of one of the nation's top universities. He was a professional with years of experience and respect in his field. More importantly, his family name carried power. His father had spent decades building credibility in the legal world, connections that stretched far beyond the walls of that precinct. The officers thought they had clipped the wings of a man too bold to fly. Instead, they had just set in motion a chain of events that would clip their own. For every insult, for every careless accusation, for every ounce of disrespect, there would be a reckoning, and he would be the one to deliver it. By the time they pushed him into the holding cell, the weight of injustice had become almost physical, pressing against his chest with every breath. The cold bench beneath him felt like a stage, one he had not chosen, but one he knew he had to command. Around him, other men sat in silence, their eyes dull with resignation. their spirits chipped away by countless encounters with the same machine. But he refused to wear that same look. He was not broken. He was calculating. As the hours ticked by, memories flooded in. He thought of his mother, who had once told him, "Never let them write your story for you. You hold the pen." He thought of the countless times he had been followed in stores, the suspicious glances, the clutching of purses when he walked too close. All of it had built up to this moment, this public stripping of dignity. But his mother's words held firm. They could put him in a cell, but they could not take the pen from his hand. The guards didn't see the quiet power in his eyes. They laughed as they walked past, making casual jokes about big checks and big lies. But their laughter was the nervous kind, the kind that tried to mask insecurity. Deep down, they feared men like him, educated, unshaken, unwilling to bow. They mistook silence for weakness, not realizing it was strategy. He was gathering every detail, every name, every word. When the time came, his memory would be sharper than any blade. Hours later, when his phone call was finally granted, he dialed not just a number but a lifeline. The voice on the other end carried authority, calm but commanding, a reminder of the world beyond these walls that the officers had chosen to forget. It was his father. And when he explained what had happened, the false accusations, the unlawful arrest, there was no panic, no despair. His father simply said, "Good. Now we make them answer." Those words were like steel in his spine. He knew what came next. His father wasn't just any man. He was a respected figure in the legal field, a man whose reputation stretched into courtrooms and offices the officers would one day dread walking into. This wasn't just about freedom anymore. It was about exposure, accountability, and justice. They had assumed their actions would disappear into silence. Instead, they had just given him a platform, and he intended to use it. The next morning, the bank's marble walls no longer gleamed with quiet authority, but with the stain of scandal. News spread quickly, as it always does when the powerful are careless. A black man arrested for depositing his own money. On the surface, it sounded absurd, almost laughable, but for those who lived the truth, it was anything but surprising. It was the story of a nation, condensed into one humiliating scene, and now it was about to explode beyond the walls of the precinct. His father arrived not in anger but in precision. He walked into the station dressed in the calm dignity of a man who had fought too many battles to waste energy on shouting. His presence was a storm contained in silence, the kind that made even seasoned officers straighten their posture and clear their throats. The moment he introduced himself, the air changed. The same men who had laughed hours earlier now stumbled over their words, suddenly aware of the depth of their mistake. The father didn't waste time. He asked for records, demanded documentation, and noted every delay. He spoke with the assurance of a man who knew the law better than the very people tasked with enforcing it. And when they tried to brush off their actions as protocol, he cut through the excuse with surgical precision. Protocol does not replace probable cause. What you did was unlawful, and now it's documented. But it wasn't just about legal words. It was about presence. The son, watching from the holding cell, felt pride swell in his chest. Here was proof that dignity could fight back, that history's weight could be carried not with despair, but with strength. For the first time since the cuffs had closed around his wrists, he smiled. Not because he was free yet, but because he knew freedom was inevitable. As they left the station together, the silence between father and son was heavy with unspoken promises. They both knew this was bigger than one wrongful arrest. This was about setting a precedent, about sending a message that the days of silent suffering were over. The bank had tried to brand a customer as a criminal. The police had tried to reduce a man to a stereotype. Now both would face the consequences. Walking out into the daylight, the son inhaled deeply. It wasn't just fresh air. It was the beginning of justice. The world had tried to bury him in chains. Instead, it had planted the seeds of his resistance. The days that followed moved like ripples after a stone strikes still water. At first, quiet conversations in offices and whispers in hallways. Then louder voices, lawyers, journalists, and community leaders who had grown tired of the same story repeating itself. Each person who heard what had happened felt the sting of recognition, as though it could have been them, or their brother, their father, their son. This was no isolated incident. It was the echo of a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. The son sat with his father at the kitchen table, their laptops open, papers scattered across the wood like weapons laid out for battle. They weren't just preparing a complaint. They were crafting a narrative, one that would expose not only the officers, who had acted unlawfully, but also the system that had emboldened them. "This isn't just about you," his father said. "This is about every person who's ever been humiliated for daring to exist in spaces they weren't supposed to." The son nodded. He understood now more than ever. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the boy who would grow up tomorrow, the woman who would be doubted at the counter next week, the family who would face suspicion for no reason other than the color of their skin. When the story broke publicly, it hit like a storm. Headlines blared the injustice. "Black man arrested for depositing his own check." Social media lit up. Hashtags multiplying with every retweet, every share. Outrage swelled not only from the black community, but from allies who could no longer ignore the blatant absurdity of the situation. The bank scrambled to issue a statement, fumbling between apology and excuse, while the police department tried to minimize the incident as a misunderstanding. But the people weren't buying it. The son spoke for the first time on camera, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," he said. "This was a choice. A choice to see my skin before my humanity. A choice to treat me as guilty when all I did was deposit money I worked for. And choices have consequences." Those words ignited something deeper. They weren't just about him. They were about a collective exhaustion turned into a collective demand. The bank had its reputation on the line. The police department had its credibility crumbling. But most importantly, a man who had once been silenced in handcuffs now stood with the world listening. Courtrooms have their own kind of silence, a weight that hangs over every word spoken, every document filed, every glance exchanged. When the case finally made its way before a judge, that silence became a stage, and he stepped onto it not as a victim but as a man demanding justice. The bank's lawyers sat stiff in their suits, papers stacked neatly in front of them, rehearsed lines ready to paint the incident as an unfortunate accident. The officers' representatives mirrored the same posture, leaning on procedure as if it were a shield strong enough to hide behind. But when his father rose to speak, the room shifted. His voice was calm, deliberate, carrying not just the facts but the weight of history. He laid out every misstep, every violation, every assumption made by people who thought authority meant impunity. "My client was arrested not because of what he did," he said, "but because of who he is. The law is meant to protect citizens, not punish them for existing." Each word landed like a strike of a gavel, undeniable and sharp. The son watched, his jaw set, his hands folded on the table. He knew the truth was finally being spoken out loud, not whispered behind closed doors or dismissed as exaggeration. The lies were unraveling, and those who had woven them now sat in their unraveling fabric, exposed and trembling beneath the calm force of accountability. Witnesses were called, bank employees, who fumbled through contradictory statements, officers who couldn't align their stories. Evidence was presented, clear, unshakable, damning. The narrative that had once seemed airtight to those who acted on prejudice, now cracked wide open under the light of scrutiny. And then came his turn. Standing before the judge, he didn't raise his voice or beg for sympathy. He simply told the truth, with the same quiet strength he had held in the holding cell. "I walked into that bank to deposit the money I earned through honest work. Instead, I was treated like a criminal. I wasn't seen as a customer. I wasn't even seen as a man. I was seen only through the lens of bias. And that is not just wrong, it is dangerous." The judge leaned forward, listening closely. The room was still. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt the scales of justice shift, ever so slightly, toward balance. The verdict came not in a roar, but in the measured cadence of justice. Finally spoken aloud, the court acknowledged what the bank and the officers had tried so hard to deny. The arrest had been unlawful, the humiliation unjustified, the assumptions rooted in prejudice. Damages were awarded, apologies were forced into the record, and the men who had once smirked behind badges and bank counters now lowered their eyes under the weight of consequence. But for him, the true victory wasn't in the money or even the ruling. It was in the shift he could feel, however slight, in the world around him. Strangers approached him outside the courthouse, some with tears, some with gratitude, all carrying the same message: thank you for standing up. He realized then that his story was no longer just his own. It had become a beacon for those who had been silenced too long, proof that dignity could fight back and win. That night, sitting with his father, he reflected on the journey. The bank had tried to brand him a criminal. The police had tried to write him into a script that wasn't his. But he had taken back the pen. He had rewritten the ending, not just for himself, but for everyone who would walk into a bank, a store, or a station tomorrow and demand to be treated as human first. Injustice had tried to bury him. Instead, it had planted him deeper into his purpose. And as he looked ahead, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a legacy, one where silence would never again be mistaken for defeat.